in complete order, but roughly in order. I'm going to start with some of the statistics. So just in terms of languages in the world, there are basically about 7,000 languages in the world. It's a bit hard to see the colours here, but it's meant to be a graph here just showing you the numbers that, there's this tiny little bit, which is about 700 languages have the whole Bible. A few more have the New Testament and scripture portions. Almost 4,000 languages don't have any scripture whatsoever. So it's a staggering number. So those are the answers for 2, 3 and 4. Now of those 4,000, it's not that there are 4,000 languages that necessarily need translation, because some of those languages, it might only be a small handful of people that speak them. It might be that the people are sufficiently bilingual in another language that they could cope with using the Bible in another language. It's estimated that of those 4,000, you've still got about 2,000 to 2,500 that need translation. But we're not just talking about languages, actually. These languages are people. It's the people we're talking about that don't have access to the scripture. And this is kind of the spread of where these languages occur. So you can see there's a lot of needs in Asia and in Africa. In the Pacific, if you look, there's just this tiny little blob here, Papua New Guinea, where 800 languages are spoken. It's amazing, just in one tiny little country. When you think of what we've got in the UK and what a country like that has. But again, these are people, and basically 1.5 billion people do not have access to the whole Bible in their heart language. So, those are the answers for the first few.
Are you doing fastest?
How are you doing so far? You got 3? Close, yeah. What?
2.
Okay, so you can see there is a staggering need, and it just shows how fortunate we are. We don't just have one translation. We've got a whole selection of translations. If there's one translation we're not quite sure of the meaning, or we want to get a slightly different flavour, we can try a different translation and a different translation. And yet you've got people that this number who don't have access to the whole Bible.
Are there any new languages that you know of being formed?
Languages are always in change.
Yes.
Yeah. So languages are never static. And that's one of the difficulties in saying, well, how many languages are there in the world? Sometimes you think, well, there's one language over here, and then they send people in who discover, actually, it's not just one language, but it's 5 different languages, or it's 10 different languages. So the number of languages is, in terms of what is known, we can just say these are the number of known languages.
You mentioned Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
Every valley has a different language.
Yeah, every valley has a different language. Likewise in Nepal, every valley has a different language. Okay, so we're going to, having done the statistics, we're now going to jump to some of the questions on the other page and then come back. Because one of the questions that some people say to Wycliff, and a lot of particularly young people ask this question, well, all this technology in the world, why do we still need to train translators? Why can't we utilise this technology? Why can't we use computers to do a lot of the work? After all, a computer can do things in a fraction of the time that humans can. So just to show that actually you need a little bit more than a computer to be able to translate, and you do need to understand the language, I've got a few things that Google Translate tried to translate. Okay, so one of them was from Hausa. Now the Hausa Bible is a correct Bible. So this is not that the Hausa Bible is a bad Bible. What it is that Google is a bad translator. Okay? So Google came up with this. So what did you come up with as what this might be? Any ideas of what verse it might be? What it might say? Okay, so I'm going to put the NIV here. I'm not obviously expecting you to quote the NIV. I'm not you might have quoted a different translation. You might have just got the gist of what it said, and that's quite okay. I'm not expecting you to actually be able to quote what it should, but actually that's what the verse is in the NIV. And notice one of the differences. So Google's done quite okay with the living in peace, and you can see we're clean, holy, but there's a big difference between nobody will see the Lord and without holiness no one will see the Lord. A big difference in translation there. So that's just one example of a bad translation. Here's another example from Slovenian. So again, for the Hausa, give yourself half a mark or no mark, depending on whether you got the gist of it or not. Okay? Use your discretion as to how much of the gist of it you got. Okay, Slovenian by Google. So I wonder what this was. So, what it actually was this. Well done. Why Google wanted to bring the hordes to the glorious end, I have no idea. I guess you've got the work will carry it, so the it, Google, you can kind of guess why Google might have gone down that route, but it shows the issues with translation. If you don't understand how the language works and you just try to translate things by computer.
You got that one, actually.
Okay. One more, again, just to show. So this one wasn't on the sheet, but it was just another one to illustrate that even if you can translate all the words, you just need to get a tiny little bit wrong with the way that you put words together and you can completely alter the meaning. So this was Google Translate from Chinese. Have a look at this. What is the benefit of an individual who's earned the world but lost his life? Now what it should be, what is it for someone to gain the whole world and forfeit their soul? So you can see the benefits there, so benefit good, you can see individual or someone, but just that little change sort of for or of, that little bit in the middle has made a complete difference to the meaning. And that's why we spend so much time having to train translators in terms of linguistics, how languages work, so that you can actually translate that in a way that actually means that what you want it to mean in the language. But we can't just rely on technology to do the job for us. Okay, so part of what we do in the Wycliff training program is sort of training in this part of linguistics and words and how words fit together. Another whole part is how you actually write a language, because a lot of the languages that don't have any scripture are unwritten languages. So, the first job, even before you can translate, is to work out how this language is going to be written on paper. And if you don't work it out right, you could end up writing something that looks like this. Okay? If you don't really know what's going on with the sounds of the language and how to put it down on paper in a way that makes sense for that language. So I wonder how you got on with working out what this says.
Got a headache.
Got a headache! Okay, that's what it should say. Okay, I heard various groups discussing it and I heard that you were getting some of the words. Imagine trying to read your Bible like this all the time. So every time you picked up the Bible, you've got a Bible, but it's a whole decoding exercise. You know, it will fry your brain after just one verse. Imagine having to do that every time you pick up your Bible. So to say, oh yes, they've got a Bible, isn't sufficient. You've got to be able to actually read it easily and not having to go through a whole decoding process to try and work out what it says. Okay, and that was just some very simple sound system rules I used. Yeah, so it was basically, I said, well, which is some of the things that people do. I haven't got enough letters in the alphabet, so I will just use one letter for two sounds. So you'll notice a f and a v. And this has just been used with the one sound, with the one letter. And there's various other things like that where it's trying to say, well, imagine you didn't have enough vowels in the alphabet, what would you do? So I took one of the vowels away. So it's little things like that. But that's really what happens, the kind of thing that can happen. You end up with something like that. So again, part of the training that we provide is how you write down a language. Okay, again, give yourself a mark or half a mark, depending on how close you think you got to the gist of that. Okay, so I'm now going to go back over the ones we missed. So that gives you an idea of why we translate, some of the things that translators have to battle with. One of the things translators have to decide what to do with is metaphors. So the heart, when we use it speaking about anything other than this beating organ in our body, we're using it metaphorically. So a metaphor being something that is not its literal meaning. So when you say, there your treasure is, there your heart will be, we're not saying that if you deposit £50,000 in the bank, you're actually ripping this heart out of your body and putting it in the bank. We're not saying that. When we use the heart in this way, we're using it essentially to mean the centre of our feeling, our emotions, our desires. But that's from our cultural perspective. And it's very convenient for us that our cultural perspective matches with the biblical cultural perspective. So you can have heart in the Bible, and it means something to us. We understand heart as centre of emotion. But what about if you're from a language or a culture where the heart really is just a beating organ, and a different part of your body, as far as your culture is concerned, is what does the feeling. So each of those things, the throat and the liver and the bowels, are all different parts of the body which different parts of the world view as centres of emotion. And it just so happens the one that I happened to choose was liver. A lot of languages, you feel things in your liver, not in your heart. Okay? Okay. And similar to that, there are idioms. So if you take the metaphor and say, well, it's not something, we're not talking about a literal heart. Likewise, you can take a whole phrase and say, well, we don't mean that literally. And there are lots of idioms in the Bible. I didn't choose a biblical idiom, I just chose something else for fun. So translators have to deal with idioms. It just so happens that in Nepali, to eat a potato is to fail an exam. Because a potato is round like a zero. Well, why do we rain cats and dogs? Yeah, it's just as, yeah. But translators have to deal with idioms. Translators also have to deal with what we say narrative structure. So when you put sentences together, what does that mean? What does that imply? So in Mixtec, in Mexico, when you tell a story or an event, something that happened, you mention the main character once and then never mention them again. That's how you tell a story. So, imagine telling the story at the beginning of Genesis. The first time you say God spoke, God said, let there be light. Well, you've introduced God, so then you would never mention him again. So then when the next verse comes and says, and God said, that must be a different God. And then when you say again, and God said, that must be a different God. So actually, if you were to just translate Genesis literally without understanding that narrative structure, that's what the people would think. Oh, lots of gods did the creation. Okay, so, again, things that translators have to understand about the language. And the other thing that translators have to understand about how a language works is the sounds of the language and what the language is doing with very fine details of sounds. So it just so happens in Mishtek, what you do with your voice, whether your voice goes up or down, that makes a difference to the meaning. And that little bit where you notice there was an accent going one way or an accent going the other way, that's to do whether your voice goes up or down. And that makes the difference between, it's called tone, it makes the difference between God saved and God might have saved but didn't. If you don't, and if you're not aware of that tone, because after all, in our languages, we don't change the meaning like that in English. If you're not aware of it, you could completely convey the wrong meaning. Okay, so
Yes, we do have it in our language.
we do, you could say, but a question and answer.
Yeah.
So you could say, I'm going to the shops, or you're going to the shops. You're going to the shops, you can question, you can answer, but that's the extent to which we do it. Many languages, you'll say, na, that means me, na, which means drum, na, which means something else. And you can completely change the meaning. So that's just a little flavour of the world of linguistics and Bible translation and why translators need training and what they do. So just out of interest, how did you do? 5? 7.5? You didn't count? Okay. Any other takers? 2.5? 4 or 5? It looks like a 7. We've got a 7. Wow.
I'd get the prize box out, but it's behind the screen.
Yes.
Okay. Well, so that was just a little bit of fun, but hopefully has been informative and enlightening just in terms of what translation is about and essentially why I do what I do. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes telling you a little bit about me and then open it up for questions. So for those of you who are wondering where does my strange accent come from, well, before I show you, I want to hold a metaphor in your mind, okay? It's a metaphor of a jigsaw puzzle. You'll see where it comes in a minute, and also Romans 8:28. In all things God works for good, and as I go through a little bit of my story, you'll see why I've got Romans 8:28 there, although I'm not going to refer to it again. I will refer to the jigsaw again, and you'll see why I'm referring to a jigsaw. But why I've got a funny accent? That's where I grew up, in New Zealand. So I was born and bred there, and lived the first 21 years of my life in New Zealand. I became Christian when I was fairly young. Throughout my teenage years, I read lots of missionary biographies, autobiographies, and was challenged by the needs in the world. And you read all these what seemed exciting stories about people serving God in different places. I also listened to a lot of Christian music. There was a singer-songwriter at the time by the name of Keith Green, who sang the song Jesus Commands Us to Go, which again really spoke to me. And by the time I'd left university in New Zealand, I really felt that God was calling me into full-time mission. I didn't know what at that point, or where, or when, but I knew that that was what God was calling me to do. And so, to cut a long story short, I came to the UK, I met my husband, got married, and in 1992 we trained with Wycliff Bible Translators. In 1993 we landed here in Nepal. Beautiful country about the size of Wales. Lots and lots of natural beauty, of course, with the highest mountains in the world. Two major religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, and about 90% of the population is either Hindu or Buddhist. A small church which is growing. The church in Nepal is actually growing very fast. 150 different languages. Okay, so that's where we as a family started off. But we didn't stay in the city, we were working in a people group high in the mountains. It's another story how we felt called to that particular people group, but to get to that people group we had to take an 18-hour bus ride. We then had to take a little mountain plane into the mountains and then walk for 5 days up what were sometimes pretty horrendous trails with, at that time, 2 small children. We subsequently had 2 more children. I've got 4 children altogether, but at that time we had 2. You can see the kind of thing we had to walk on with them to get up to the mountain villages, and ended up in this place. There's a people group called the Dolpo, living in an area called Dolpa. An totally unreached people group, Tibetan Buddhist, very low literacy, maybe about 5% literacy, language had never been written down, to all intents and purposes cut off from a lot of the rest of Nepal, and we spent several years working amongst them. Yes, just sharing God through our lives and our deeds, learning the language, doing the linguistic work that you need to do before the translation actually happens. So you've seen from all the earlier bit that it's not just a case of translating, it's a case of working out what are the sounds of the language, how are you going to write this language down, how does the language work, how do the words of the language fit together. So we were doing all of that kind of thing whilst living amongst them. We lived amongst them, making basically half of the year, and then half of the year we were down in the city because it's too difficult to live up there in winter. But after a few years we then had to return to the UK, and so that's where kind of my personal story and the Dolpa story depart a little bit, but not quite. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened to Dolpa and then what happened to me. So we continued making trips back to Dolpa even after we'd come back to the UK. So moved back to the UK, settled the boys into school here. Sometimes I would make a trip back to Nepal, or Steve looked after the boys. Sometimes he would make a trip back, or I looked after the boys. Sometimes we would both make a trip back, whilst Steve's parents looked after the boys. Yeah, we did various juggling type things to keep getting back to Dolpa. So just in terms of what happened to Dolpa, one part of the puzzle was us going back. So that's the photo of us. Said at that point we had 2 children. One of our trips back to Nepal, we met a young Nepalese evangelist who trekked the trails up to Dolpa with us, who was, says to us so many times afterwards, he said to us and still says to me today, he said, it was just an amazing time, he said, because it was such a dark place, but I knew that God was calling me there. It was like he was so challenged by the fact that we as foreigners could go there with small children. What on earth was he doing as a Nepali not going there? So he started making trips up to Dolpa to bring the gospel, tell people about the Lord. Not only that, he raised up a whole team of people to go up to Dolpa, to live there, a whole church planting team. and over the years has sent more and more Nepalese believers in teams up to Dolpa. Then an American Wycliff couple came along who said, we feel called to Dolpa, and they took over, as it was becoming harder and harder for us to make trips back, they took over the actual translation work. And the Bible, that's not actually the Dolpa Bible, that's just a picture of a Bible in a related language, but basically the Dolpa Bible is almost finished now. So they've been continuing with it. And then, in more recent years, the little boy, in that picture, the younger of the two there, who's actually my second son, now, he and his wife are back at Dolpa. He, as a teenager, he felt called to go back to Dolpa. He said to me, a long time afterwards, he said he had to really, really seek God and know, was this what God was saying to him as an adult, or was it just because he had a romantic dream of being a Dolpa as a child? But he and his wife are now there, doing community development. His heart is for discipleship, and there are now, a small handful of believers in Dolpa, and he's got a heart to see them become strong believers. So very much, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. I'm just one part. We, as a family, were just one part of that puzzle. And sometimes we look and see, sometimes I think back when I think, well, what did I actually do in Dolpa for the time I was there? Yeah, I learned the language. Yeah, I worked out what was happening, but we didn't see the translation from start to finish. I didn't see the church grow from start to finish. We just were a little part. And sometimes we can feel, well, was my part really significant? But actually, God's got that whole picture there. It's like the little part that we have to play is one piece of that puzzle. And God's got the big piece. And God knows the full picture. And if you were to take one piece of that jigsaw puzzle out, I don't know if you've had the frustrating experience, you make a jigsaw and that last piece is lost and the picture doesn't look complete because one of the pieces is missing. But it's like God is putting together a jigsaw puzzle. So I tend to think of what's happened in Dolpa and also what's happened in my life afterwards is one piece in a jigsaw puzzle. So that's what's happened to Dolpa, and that's where we started off as a family, and sort of God calling us into missions and God calling us into the work of Bible translation. So for me then so we settled back in the UK and gradually needed to spend more and more time in the UK and less time making trips to Nepal. I basically started teaching with Wycliff, training the next generation of Bible translators, passing on the skills and knowledge that I had gained from being up in Dolpa and what I'd continued to gain from making trips back. Steve, before he went to be with the Lord, was doing a lot of computer software for Wycliff. So although we've seen computers aren't very good at translating, we've seen what Google Translate does, actually there are a lot of very useful things that computers can do. And so he spent a lot of his time and his skills, because he was a software engineer before we went into missions, using his software skills to write programs for Wycliff. So I got involved with training, and basically that's what I've been doing ever since. I've been training the next generation of Bible translators. And in terms of the Wycliff UK training program, just put a little sort of picture of, well, basically, I couldn't really put a dot on where we are without putting a big dot over the whole of the UK. But in terms of when I think what students I've actually taught over the years, in terms of people that have come to us, trained as translators and gone out to countries around the world. And these are all the different countries that our students have gone to over the last few years. Basically every continent, a lot in Africa, a lot in Asia. You've already seen that those are the two continents which have the greatest needs. A few elsewhere. People in countries where I haven't even put dots, because they're countries that you don't really want to talk about or let people know that there are actually people working there. And again, I look at, well, I'm instructing, I'm teaching people, I'm passing on my skills and knowledge. People are going out. It's again like a part of the jigsaw puzzle. I'm no longer out there full time, but others are, and together we're creating this, or God is creating through us, this picture of bringing His word to to every people group. So that's what I do with most of my time, is in the UK, training others to go out. But I do spend part of my time continuing to make trips back overseas to consult for projects and to give projects short term, like a week or 2 week at a time, help with particular needs that they have where they need to call somebody in to help. So just one of the projects that I've been involved with is in northeast India. And I put up the verse that we put earlier on the Bible, of the little quiz, because that's pretty much my speciality, is the particular thing that I'm involved with within this whole picture of translation when I go out is usually trying to sort out writing systems. So this particular people group, Lambda, they have 2 New Testaments. They had one that was done in about 1990, one that was done in about 2000. Both of them use different writing systems. Both of them are equally as unintelligible to the people as that was to you. Where maybe they can sort it out, they have to essentially decipher what their Bible says. It's not easy for them to read. And so I've been trying to help them sort out what's going on and how to make revisions to their writing system so that they can actually read their language and they can actually write the scriptures. But again, it's one part of the puzzle that God is doing, putting together for Lambda. I'm helping them sort out their writing system. Their teams of teachers working with children. And so this was a Sunday school group trying to test little children's Bible stories with the new writing system to see if the children could understand the revisions we had done. There's a literacy project bringing mother tongue literacy to adults. So again, it's just what I'm doing, I feel like, is one part of the puzzle, but through that, God is bringing accessibility of the scriptures to that people group. So that's just a little flavour of what I do, what I'm involved with, what Wycliff does, and the big picture of Wycliff. And now I guess I'd like to open it up to you if you've got questions. And I can answer any questions you have.
Thank you.
How long did it take you to have this expertise? How much training did you have to go through?
So I started off doing a year's training with Wycliff, which is their standard sort of training. Now they do it in 6 months. People go out for a bit, come back, do another 6 months. When I did it, it was a year. But then that only gets you to the level of doing so much. About 10 years later, I then, as well as teaching, at the same time as trying to teach, and actually at the same time that Steve went to be with the Lord, I'd enrolled in the PhD. Steve had encouraged me to enrol it, so I actually enrolled in a linguistic PhD at SOAS in London to get further linguistic training, to get further expertise, so that I could then equip people more in terms of being able to help with like the really deep, difficult puzzles that people involved with. So yeah, there's a level of expertise that's needed, and as I said, in terms of what I do, I ended up having to go and get my PhD to be able to do what I do. But
I presume you don't use no-go?
No.
How long does it take you to actually compile a Bible? Because it sounds as if it's a bit of a back and forth.
Yeah, that's right. So it depends. If in an ideal world, maybe a New Testament could be done in 10 years, say. Maybe.
And
Sometimes it might take...
It's changed a bit.
Well, yeah, and maybe it would take 20 years in some projects. It's very variable. Sometimes you've got languages where they rely on a lot of outside help from translators because there are very few sufficiently educated people in the language group. Other languages, you have a lot of mother tongue speakers who have gone through university and are actually highly educated. So in those language groups, people, expatriates might come in from Wycliff to work alongside local mother tongue translators, and that's becoming more the pattern as more local people become better educated, because after all, who's the best to translate into the language but the people themselves? But often they need the consultant help from outside. So every project is different.
Is
But it's
there
not
any?
quick.
Yeah, it's not quick.
Sorry.
Is there any language that you know of in the world that has already an established writing system that doesn't have the Bible? I guess the flip side of that is it? Do you have to develop the writing system for every single language?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So there are some where they have developed their own writing system. So as a general rule, the majority, if they haven't had any work done in them, the majority of languages with nothing probably have no writing system, but there are some where they have developed a writing system. There are some where people have tried to write the language, but there's no standard writing system, so everybody writes it a different way. And so it's not so much that you've got to start from scratch, but you go in and everybody's writing it differently, and you've got to figure out which way you're going to write it. And what do you do if you're going to translate? Which version of the writing system are you going to use? And are you going to be able to standardise it? So there's a lot of variation and issues.
The place you went to in Nepal, did you say it was called
Dolpa.
Dolpa? When you said when you got there, hardly anyone could read.
That's
or
right.
write. So did you have to then teach them so that they could read the Bible? Or
So there is, over the last probably 10 years, 15 years, there is a Nepali school up there. So people go to school, or the majority of children go to school now until they're about 11 or 12. So it's only a primary school that's there. And some of the children might only go to school for a year or two because parents need them in the field. But at least there are some children that are getting education. A lot of the adults still don't read. One of the issues is that with the school up there now is that kids start to learn to read and think, oh, good, I'm going to go to Kathmandu and make a better life for myself. And so you tend to get those that are educated moving away and those that are illiterate staying in the village. So it is an issue now. What Wycliff is doing more and more is you will put it in writing, but you'll also have it as an app. A lot of people have phones. Even in remote places, they have phones where they can access the internet, and they might be slow phones compared with what we've got, but a lot of people have phones that can run very simple apps. And so developing Bible apps so people can hear it and they can follow it, where the app might actually highlight the text as it is read. So Wycliff is doing a lot with that kind of technology to help bring the Bible into communities where the literacy level isn't high enough for people just to have a paper copy.
How long would you say would be for a new group? How would you like to place Wycliff people? They can work at home, but then you want to put them with.
Again, it's difficult because you've got to be there long enough to, I guess, be useful. It's just like anything. When you go, you're new and you've got to learn things. So if you were going from scratch, the first thing you've got to do is to learn the language. And that can take time. So you've got to think, well, you're learning the language, that takes time. You've got to work out how the language works. But again, more and more, Wycliff is like, rather than just saying, well, okay, you as a family, you as a couple, you as an individual, you're going to go and be placed here for the next 10 years, 20 years to work with this people group. Wycliff is saying, well, your expertise is in exegesis and your expertise is in linguistics, and somebody else's expertise is in something else. So trying to create teams of several Wycliffe people with different skills, but can then, together as a team, target several different people groups at once. And generally that works a lot more efficiently than one couple working with one people group from start to finish.
How does a team who are working on something, a translation, how do they approach difficult verses? Verses that even in English there's disputes about what to translate.
With difficulty, there's no, like Wycliffe doesn't prescribe, this is the way you should do it. So if you think back to the heart metaphor that we put up, do you try and be faithful to, the Greek and say, well, the word for heart was used, we need to use heart? Or do you try and be faithful to the culture that you're translating in and say, well, the heart is a metaphor, we're going to use the liver in that verse because that's what, it's not, no clear-cut answer. And clearly people that come from Wycliffe come from different church backgrounds, so in terms of their own personal preference for, do you prefer a very literal Bible in English, or do you prefer a very paraphrased Bible in English, or anything in between? People are coming from different backgrounds and going to different cultures, and Wycliffe tries to be careful not to prescribe, but to talk about things, discuss things, Wycliffe consultants will help try and discuss. Sometimes what happens is that Wycliffe starts off with a very paraphrased Bible so that people can easily understand it, and then the next version of the Bible that comes out might be a less paraphrased one, a more, I wouldn't say literal, but moving in that direction, or something that's more literal but with a lot more footnotes. So you can imagine a community just starting with the Bible maybe can't cope with study guides and footnotes and explanations. So we can read a word and we don't quite know what that means. We can look at the footnotes. Maybe when you start off you haven't got the skills to be able to do that. But 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whenever the community say, well actually we want a different version, maybe the next version would be slightly different from the first version. But there's no answer, no easy answer, because every situation is different.
A lot of missionaries apparently use medicine as a, so we say, sideline to get into people. Did that ever occur to you, or did you use that line?
So a lot of Wycliffe missionaries are working in countries where you can't go in as a missionary. We were. So when we went to Nepal, the easiest way to get a visa for us was to apply to the university in Kathmandu for a research visa, to do some research. And we said, well, we want to research what's happening, and the Nepal government liked that, because then we produced a little paper about one of their ethnic groups, and they liked that. It's one more piece of paper that they have got in their archive somewhere, but that got us the visa. Some people get in with teaching, or doing medicine, or doing something else. Some countries, people can just go in and say, yeah, I'm a missionary. And the country says, great, we want you, but sometimes that's not the case, and you've got to think of creative ways of getting there and staying there.
What's your typical day when you're in England?
What's my typical day? Well, if it's in the teaching term, it is pretty much the same as any what I would say secular university lecturer, where you've got delivering lectures and marking assignments and things like that. So our training programs, all our Wycliffe training programs, one thing we did with them a number of years ago was we put them under the umbrella of a university, because then people can come out the end of it with a MA. And many countries where people go to, the country wants foreigners to have a high level of education. They want a piece of paper that says you've got an MA. And there's some countries you wouldn't be able to go to if you didn't have that. So what Wycliff did was they brought their training program under the umbrella, it's currently under the umbrella of the University of Gloucestershire. So all our Wycliff future Bible translators who come with us, essentially they're getting all this training, which University of Gloucestershire is happy with, and get an MA out of it at the end. So on the one hand, we're training for Bible translation. On the other hand, we are trying to deliver MA level education to satisfy the university. But it works because then people going out have an MA which they can basically show to the government and the country they're working with, which gives them credibility in terms of being able to do what they do.
Do you do it online or face-to-face? Sorry.
Face-to-face, it's face-to-face, yeah. Face-to-face.
And what did the people make of you? You know, like, they might have thought, oh, yeah, a few weeks, I'll put up with these foreigners, and then you stay and you increase, you know, go from 2 to 4.
Generally very receptive. When we were up in Dolpa, people were incredibly hospitable and they didn't know, I don't know what they made of us in terms of what are these crazy foreigners doing living up in our valley, but they were very welcoming, particularly when they discovered if they had a broken watch or a broken radio and they brought it into our house, then Steve would be able to get a screwdriver out and tinker, and they'll give it back to them, and it worked again, and they thought this was great. But generally they were very receptive.
You had your own house then, it sounds like.
We had to rent we rented.
But it would be one of their accommodations?
Yeah, one of theirs.
Yeah.
And they were receptive, you know, every situation is different, but where we were, there was somebody in the community who said, oh, you know, I built a house 2 years ago, which I'm now living in. My old house is just now being used as a hay barn to store hay. I'll move the hay out and you can have the house. I mean, so a house means 2 rooms, 1 room for the living, cooking, everything else, and 1 room for the everybody sleeping. But it's a house.
One for the goats and one for you.
Oh yeah, they had goats and sheep and horses and everything, because the houses were like 2 stories, and generally the ground level is easy access in, where all the animals live.
Central
And you go
heating.
upstairs, and the people living is above.
So central heating then.
Right?
Yeah, central heating.
Central heating, yes.
How long did it take you to learn?
It takes a long time it's a short time to get to the point where you can communicate easily. So within a few months we were like speaking it to the point where you can talk to somebody on day-to-day things, but then it takes ages and ages and ages afterwards to be able to learn it any deeper than that. So.
Yeah, how did you learn to write it? Because it's all very well hearing and talking something, and a child can do that.
Yep.
But you ask a child to write
That's
a
right.
sentence, and they can't even write a word.
So,
or a letter.
so one of the things that when anyone comes through Wycliff, and again what we had to learn when we first came to Wycliff, is learning how to write things phonetically, so that when you hear something you can write it down. Now that's not going to be the way it's going to be written, but that's for your benefit. So at least you can write things down phonetically, so that everything you hear you can write down, and then having written it down you can play with it like a big, in a sense, like a big Sudoku puzzle or a big logical puzzle, and start to look at the little bits that you've written that look the same in different places and try and work out what they mean, and basically take it from there. And only then, once you've really worked out, you then start to think, well, how are we really going to write this language down so that it's useful to the people?
Do you get involved, the guys that are literate? to check what you're doing? And
Yeah, so if you're working in a community where there are literate people, you spend a lot of time working with them, getting them checking. So again, that's actually one thing that we were doing here. So in this picture, what I'd done was we'd taken something that was essentially like that. We'd made various revisions, or I'd suggested various revisions. So we then printed some little folk stories with the revisions in. So what I'm doing here is like this girl, she's reading a draft version of a folk story written in a different way, something more readable than that. And I was busy making a note of the things where she stumbled and the things that she found easy. And then you take that and say, well, let's redraft it, let's try doing this and doing that. Then we took it and gave it to some children and printed some little Bible stories with it. And so there's a teacher there trying to see how well the children can read it. So that's the kind of thing
that's brilliant.
we would do.
And that would have been the first time that they'd really universally had language, written language.
So with this particular community, in terms of readable language,
Yes.
this would be the first time they had something that was essentially like that. As I said, two different New Testaments, each written a different way, each equally unintelligible.